We think of great battles as being decided by admirals on the bridges of their flagships. But in 1942, the fate of the entire Pacific War was in the hands of a few exhausted men in a concrete basement, staring at a secret their own command refused to believe. The Japanese war machine was about to deliver a knockout blow, and the only clue these men had was a two-letter ghost on the radio AF. To save the American fleet, they first had to fight and win a war against their own side. The war, for Commander Joseph Rochefort, didn't smell of salt air or cordite. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke, sweat, and the bitter, burnt umber aroma of coffee that had been on a hot plate for 12 hours too long. It was the smell of the basement. A windowless, soundproof tomb deep beneath the 14th Naval District headquarters at Pearl Harbor. The men called it the dungeon, and it was here, in this concrete crypt, that the ghost of the Japanese Imperial Navy lived. It was May 1942, 5 months since the sky had rained fire and the harbor had boiled with burning ships. 5 months of defeat. The Philippines had fallen. The Dutch East Indies were gone. The great Allied battleships Prince of Wales and Repulse were at the bottom of the South China Sea. America was on its back, swinging blindly in a fight it didn't know how to win. Up on the surface, admirals moved fleets on vast map tables, trying to impose a cold, clean logic on a war that had proven to be nothing but bloody, chaotic reality. But down here, in the hum of the ventilation and the ceaseless chatter of the teletype machines, Rochefort and his team were engaged in a different kind of war. They weren't fighting sailors, they were fighting secrets. Rochefort, a man whose mind moved like lightning but whose body seemed to prefer the comfort of a worn smoking jacket and slippers, stood before a massive blackboard. It was covered in a chaotic spiderweb of chalk lines, connecting columns of 5-digit numbers. This was JN 25, the Japanese naval code. And for months, it had been a fortress. His team a strange collection of cryptanalysts, brilliant linguists, and even a few musicians from the ship's band who had a preternatural gift for recognizing patterns had managed to pick the lock. But they couldn't swing the door open. They could only peek through the keyhole. They weren't reading sentences, they were catching whispers in a storm. A word here, a phrase there. Carrier division, refuel at, objective to be. It was like trying to assemble a dinosaur from a handful of bone fragments. But in the last few weeks, a new fragment had appeared. And it was appearing everywhere. It was just 2 letters A. F. At first, it was a ghost on the periphery. A single intercept mentioning a reconnaissance flight over AF. Then another, tasking a submarine to patrol the waters near AF. Then the whispers grew louder, more urgent. Chatter between fleet commands, logistics requests, carrier preparations. And all of them, like iron filings to a magnet, were being pulled toward this one cryptic designation. Got another one. Commander, a young ensign named Jasper Holmes called out, his voice thin with exhaustion. He was one of Rochefort's best, a sharp mind that saw patterns others missed. Holmes ripped a long strip of paper from the teletype, from the combined fleet's daily comms. Kaga and Akagi to join striking force for main operation against AF. Rochefort didn't turn. He just stared at the blackboard, his eyes tracing the phantom lines of an operation he could feel but couldn't see. Kaga, Akagi, 2 of the very same carriers that had savaged this harbor in December. This wasn't a minor raid. This wasn't a sideshow. The enemy was massing its titans, the core of its naval power. They were coiling for a strike. A knockout blow. He could feel the weight of it in the stale air of the room. It was the same weight he'd felt in the air in late November, a dreadful certainty that something immense and terrible was about to happen. He walked over to the massive map of the Pacific that dominated one wall. It was a canvas of impossible distances, dotted with tiny, vulnerable islands. He ran a hand over it, from the Aleutians in the north, down past Hawaii, to the South Pacific near Australia and New Caledonia. Somewhere in that vast blue emptiness, those 2 letters represented a real place. A piece of land. A target. For Commander Joseph Rochefort and his exhausted band of codebreakers, the war was no longer about ships or planes or bombs. It had been reduced to a single, terrifying, 2-letter mystery. A mystery they had to solve, because they had a sickening feeling that if they didn't, the next Pearl Harbor would make the first one look like a dress rehearsal. The entire Pacific War had come down to a single question: where in God's name was AF? Up on the surface, where the Hawaiian sun baked the concrete and the smell of gardenias mixed with diesel fumes, the war was a much cleaner, more orderly affair. Here, in the office of Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, the chaos of the dungeon was replaced by the crisp rustle of paper and the quiet deference of command. The answers didn't come from whispers and chalk-dusted ghosts, they came over the teletype, stamped with the authority of Washington, D.C. And this morning, an answer had arrived. The message was from OP-20G, the Navy's cryptanalytical headquarters in the capital. They were the senior service, the official voice. Compared to them, Rochefort's dungeon was a rogue, back-alley operation. The decrypt was clear, concise, and confident. They had analyzed the enemy's signals, the same signals Rochefort was agonizing over, and they had drawn their own conclusions. The Japanese were planning a major offensive, yes. But AF was a sideshow, a diversion. The main thrust, according to the best minds in Washington, was aimed north, at the Aleutian Islands. They even had a designation for it, AL. It was a perfectly logical plan. On a map, it made beautiful, strategic sense. Imagine you're a chess master trying to corner a weakened king. You don't just lunge for the king. You make a bold move on the other side of the board, something so threatening, he has to respond. That's what Washington believed the Japanese were doing. An attack on the Aleutians would threaten Alaska, putting the entire west coast of the United States on high alert. It would force Nimitz to send his precious few carriers racing north to defend American soil. Then, with the American fleet out of position, the Japanese could strike elsewhere at their leisure, perhaps south, towards Fiji or New Caledonia, severing the lifeline to Australia. The official story wasn't just an explanation, it was an elegant solution. AF was simply the magician's empty hand, meant to draw the eye while the real trick happened somewhere else. Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's fleet intelligence officer, read the dispatch with a growing knot in his stomach. Layton was the bridge between two worlds. He was a creature of the sunlit world of command, but his mind was tethered to the stale, recycled air of the dungeon. He trusted Rochefort. He trusted his almost supernatural ability to not just read the enemy's mail, but to read the enemy's mind. He folded the paper, the crispness of it feeling like a lie, and made his way to the basement. He found Rochefort exactly where he knew he would be, looking less like a naval commander and more like a rumpled academic who'd been sleeping in his office for a week. He stood before the map of the Pacific, a dead cigarette hanging from his lips. "Washington has spoken," Layton said quietly, holding out the dispatch. Rochefort took it, his eyes scanning the lines with a weary disinterest. He read it, then let it fall from his fingers to the floor. He didn't even grant it the dignity of a counterargument. He simply turned back to the map and tapped a tiny, almost invisible speck of land in the dead center of the vast blue expanse. "They're wrong, Eddie," he said, his voice a low rasp. "It's not a feint. It's the whole show. Washington is reading the words. They're not listening to the music." He explained it again, the frustration coiling in his voice. The sheer weight of the force being assembled, the carriers of the Kido Butai, the battleships, the cruisers, it was the Empire's Sunday punch. You don't use a sledgehammer to crack a walnut in the Aleutians. You use it to shatter the cornerstone of your enemy's entire position. And that cornerstone, the unsinkable aircraft carrier that guarded Hawaii itself, was that tiny dot on the map. Midway Atoll. Layton felt the terrible weight of the two realities colliding. Above him, a logical, officially sanctioned plan was being set in motion. Admirals were preparing to send ships north. Down here, a disheveled genius was quietly insisting that this elegant plan was, in fact, a blueprint for annihilation. But Rochefort's certainty was not evidence. It was instinct, informed by thousands of hours of immersion in the enemy's psyche. It wouldn't stand up in the cold court of military command. "Joe," Layton said, the words tasting like ash. "I believe you. But the Admiral has this." He gestured to the dispatch on the floor. "Washington's orders against your gut. It's not enough." He looked at the obsessive scrawl on the blackboard, the exhausted faces of Rochefort's team, the sheer, unprovable conviction in his friend's eyes. The official explanation was now set in stone, a fatal assumption that was about to sail the U.S. Pacific Fleet straight into a trap. "So how do we prove it?" Layton asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do we make the enemy tell us, in plain language that no one can deny, where they are going. The problem was a paradox, a strategic catch-22 that lay at the very heart of intelligence work. To win the war, Nimitz needed to know where the Japanese hammer would fall. But the only people who knew for certain were the Japanese themselves, and they spoke a language of numbers and codes buried inside layers of radio static. Rochefort was convinced he had the key, but his conviction was worthless without proof. He couldn't go to Nimitz and say, "Sir, I have a feeling." In the unforgiving calculus of war, feelings got fleets sunk. The stakes were almost incomprehensibly high. This wasn't just about one battle. It was about the entire Pacific theater. Let's step into the War College for a moment. Imagine the Pacific Ocean is a vast, empty arena. In one corner, you have the Japanese Imperial Navy, a heavyweight champion in its prime, flushed with victory, possessing more carriers, more experienced pilots, and a fearsome reputation. In the other corner, you have the U.S. Pacific Fleet, the underdog, battered at Pearl Harbor, outnumbered, and fighting with one arm tied behind its back. The American industrial machine was just beginning to stir, but for now, in the spring of 1942, what Nimitz had was all he was going to get. His carriers Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown were not just ships, they were the only thing preventing the Japanese from roaming the Pacific at will, from severing the supply lines to Australia, from threatening Hawaii again, and maybe even the West Coast. Losing them wasn't an option. It was the end of the line. Washington's theory, the feint to the Aleutians, demanded that Nimitz split his already inferior force, sending a good portion of it on a wild goose chase north. It was a textbook defensive reaction. But if Rochefort was right, if the main target was Midway, this textbook move would be a fatal error. It would be like a boxer turning to block a jab to his forehead, only to leave his jaw wide open for a knockout uppercut he never saw coming. The Japanese fleet, the most powerful naval force ever assembled, would arrive at Midway to find it defended by a handful of land-based planes. They would annihilate the garrison, seize the island, and then wait. Wait for the scattered American carriers to race back from the Aleutians, one by one, into the teeth of a perfectly prepared ambush. The war in the Pacific would be over by July. Back in the dungeon, the ticking clock was no longer a metaphor. It was a palpable, physical presence in the room, measured in the rhythmic clatter of the teletype machines spitting out more and more fragments of the impending Japanese operation. Each tick was a Japanese ship leaving port, a squadron of Zeros being loaded onto a flight deck, a torpedo being armed. Time was running out. Leighton and Rochefort stood before the map, the weight of this strategic precipice settling on them. They were trapped between two fatal realities. The reality of Washington's official narrative, which would lead to disaster, and the reality of their own unproven certainty, which was currently just a ghost story whispered in a basement. "We have to make them tell us," Rochefort said again, his voice now devoid of frustration, replaced by a cold, sharp edge. He was no longer just a codebreaker. He was a man forging a weapon. "We need a message from them, Eddie. A message so clear, so unambiguous, that even a politician in Washington can't misinterpret it." The idea was audacious. It was insane. It bordered on treason. They couldn't just ask the enemy their plans. They had to trick them into revealing it. They had to plant a piece of information, a lie, into the real world, and hope the enemy would pick it up, discuss it over their coded networks, and in doing so, give away the farm. It was a gambit of breathtaking arrogance. They were proposing to use the entire Japanese intelligence apparatus as their own personal confirmation service. Leighton stared at Rochefort, then at the map. He pointed to the tiny speck labeled Midway. "What kind of lie, Joe?" A slow, grim smile spread across Rochefort's face. It was the smile of a man who had just decided to flip the board over and start playing a different game entirely. "The most boring, believable lie we can think of," Rochefort said. "We're going to send a message. A message that says Midway Atoll is having a problem with its water supply." The plan was a masterstroke of reverse psychology, a piece of intellectual judo so elegant in its simplicity, it was almost beautiful. To understand its genius, you have to understand the nature of signals intelligence. Imagine you're listening in on your rival's phone calls. You can't hear them clearly, you can only pick out a few words. You hear them say they're going to the city for a big meeting. Which city? New York? Chicago? Los Angeles? You don't know. But what if you could plan a fake news story, right where you know they'll see it, saying the main airport in Chicago is closed. If you then intercept a call where they say, change of plans, the meeting can't happen where we wanted, we have to find a new location, you've just confirmed the city was Chicago without them ever saying the name. Rochefort's plan was the military equivalent of that fake news story. He wasn't just trying to confirm a location, he was trying to force the enemy to confirm it for him. The bait had to be perfect, mundane enough to be believable, but significant enough that local Japanese listening posts would deem it worthy of reporting up the chain of command. A major equipment failure, a fire, an outbreak of disease, all too dramatic. They might be interpreted as a ruse. But a broken water desalination plant? That was perfect. It was a tedious, bureaucratic, logistical headache. It was the kind of problem that real military bases have every single day. Getting the message sent, however, required climbing out of the dungeon and convincing the world of sunlight and brass eagles. Leighton took the idea to Fleet Admiral Nimitz. In his quiet, sound-dampened office, Leighton laid out the gamble. He explained Rochefort's certainty, Washington's dissent, and the desperate need for irrefutable proof. They wanted to use a secure, underwater cable one they knew the Japanese couldn't tap to send an order to the commander on Midway. The order would instruct him to broadcast a specific message. In the clear, using a lower-grade encryption they knew the Japanese had partially broken. The message was to report that the island's freshwater condenser had broken down and that they were critically short on fresh water. Nimitz, a man of quiet contemplation and immense inner calm, listened without interruption. He was a commander caught in an impossible position. His superiors in Washington were telling him one thing. His own intelligence team on the ground was telling him the exact opposite. He was being asked to trust the instincts of a brilliant but eccentric codebreaker in a basement over the official, unified voice of Naval Command. More than that, he was being asked to sanction a deliberate live broadcast into the open airwaves, an act that, if it went wrong, could confuse his own forces or, worse, reveal to the Japanese that their codes were being read. It was a career-ending, fleet-losing risk. He sat for a long moment, his steepled fingers resting against his lips, his gaze fixed on the map of the Pacific. He looked at the Aleutians, the cold, desolate islands where Washington was certain the blow would fall. Then his eyes drifted down to that tiny, strategically vital speck in the middle of nowhere. Midway, the forward sentry post for Hawaii. Do it, he said, his voice calm and level. The order flashed down the secure cable. On Midway, a communications officer received a baffling directive from Pearl Harbor. He was to dust off an old, less secure codebook and broadcast a message, unencrypted, stating that the water purification system was down. He surely thought it was madness, a catastrophic breach of protocol. But orders were orders. On May 10, 1942, a short, seemingly innocuous radio signal radiated out from the tiny atoll. Back in the dungeon, the wait began. It was the most agonizing part of the entire operation. Rochefort and his team had cast their line. Now, all they could do was sit in the suffocating silence of their basement, surrounded by humming receivers, and wait for a fish to bite. Every tick of the clock was a new torment. Had the Japanese heard it? Did they believe it? Did they even care? For 48 excruciating hours, the teletype machines chattered on with the usual, maddeningly fragmented litany of supply requests and weather reports. Nothing. The silence from the enemy was absolute. The great gamble, it seemed, had failed. The bait was floating, untouched, in the vast emptiness of the Pacific. The mood in the dungeon grew darker with every passing hour. They were running out of time, and their one brilliant shot had seemingly missed the mark entirely. The initial elation curdled into a thick, choking anxiety. 2 days turned into 3. The silence from the Japanese naval channels on the subject of Midway's water supply was deafening. In Washington, OP-20G, feeling their own analysis was being vindicated by the lack of response, doubled down. Memos circulated reinforcing the Aleutian theory. To the official arbiters of intelligence, the case was closed. Rochefort's gambit was seen as a desperate, unsophisticated trick that a cunning enemy like the Japanese Imperial Navy would never fall for. It was a dead end. In the dungeon, the atmosphere grew toxic. The air, already thick with smoke and the smell of old coffee, now felt heavy with failure. Jasper Holmes and the other analysts worked with a grim, mechanical determination, their faces pale under the green glow of the task lamps. They had believed in Rochefort. They had believed they were on the cusp of a war-winning breakthrough. Now, they felt like fools. They had stuck their necks out, challenged the entire naval intelligence establishment, and come up empty. The enemy, it seemed, was either too smart or simply wasn't listening. Rochefort himself became a ghost, pacing the concrete floor, his face a mask of sleepless frustration. He replayed the plan in his mind 1,000 times. Was the bait wrong? Was the transmission method flawed? Had the Japanese changed their codes at the last minute, rendering the entire exercise moot? The greatest fear for any intelligence officer is not that the enemy is brilliant, but that you are simply, fundamentally, wrong. That you have misinterpreted everything, that the patterns you saw were just phantoms in the static. Worse, the operational clock was still ticking. On the surface, Nimitz was being forced to act on the intelligence he did have. And the only official, actionable intelligence was pointing north. He couldn't keep his carriers sitting idle in Pearl Harbor based on the fading hope of a basement-dwelling codebreaker. The first orders were being drafted to send Task Force 16, with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, towards the Aleutians. It was happening. The nightmare scenario was unfolding in slow motion. The fleet was about to be split. The trap was about to be sprung. Rochefort's team felt like Cassandra, screaming a prophecy of doom that no one would heed because they couldn't offer a single shred of proof. Then, late on the third night, it happened. Jasper Holmes, his eyes raw from staring at endless columns of 5-digit code groups, suddenly sat bolt upright. He wasn't even working on the high-priority combined fleet traffic. Refusing to give up, he had been obsessively sifting through the dregs, the low-grade garbage intercepts from a small Japanese listening post in the Marshall Islands, the kind of routine traffic most analysts ignored. "Commander," he said, his voice a choked whisper, "I think I have something." Rochefort was by his side in an instant, the exhaustion vanishing from his face, replaced by a predatory focus. Holmes pointed a trembling finger at a freshly decoded line of text on his notepad. It was not a message from Admiral Yamamoto. It was not a grand strategic directive. It was a simple, boring, logistical report sent from that minor outpost back to a regional commander. The kind of message that oiled the gears of a vast military machine. The message read, "AF is short on water." For a moment, there was absolute silence in the dungeon, a silence more profound than any sound. It was the silence of a key turning in a lock, the silence of a bomb falling. Then, the room erupted. Men cheered, threw papers in the air, clapped each other on the back. Some just sat and wept with relief. They hadn't been wrong. The enemy wasn't too smart. They had taken the bait. They had swallowed it whole. The live broadcast from Midway had traveled through the ether, been picked up by a minor enemy outpost, and reported up the chain as fact. The Japanese Imperial Navy had just confirmed they needed to bring their own invasion supplies because their target couldn't provide them. In their own secret words, they had just told Joseph Rochefort, "We are going to Midway." The decrypt was a lightning bolt. It wasn't just a clue, it was a confession. Leighton snatched the flimsy piece of paper and ran. He didn't wait for the elevator. He took the stairs 2 at a time, bursting out of the subterranean gloom of the dungeon and into the bright, humid air of fleet headquarters. He didn't slow down, his polished shoes slapping against the linoleum floors as aides and officers turned to stare. He strode past Nimitz's secretary and entered the admiral's office without knocking. Nimitz was on the phone, likely with Washington, his face a calm, unreadable mask. He saw the look in Leighton's eyes, the piece of paper clutched in his hand like a holy relic, and held up a finger, calmly finishing his call. He hung up the receiver and turned his full attention to his intelligence officer. "Eddie?" he asked, his voice betraying no emotion. Leighton, breathless, flattened the decrypt on the admiral's polished desk. "Sir," he said, his voice tight with the enormity of the moment. "Commander Rochefort has located AF." Nimitz read the single, translated line. "AF is short on water." He read it again. He looked up at Leighton, and for the first time, a flicker of something sharp and dangerous showed in his eyes. This was it. This was the proof. This small, unassuming piece of paper was the single most important piece of intelligence the United States had received since the start of the war. It was the Rosetta Stone for the coming battle. But this breakthrough didn't come from the sanctioned, well-funded halls of OP-20G in Washington. It came from a rogue band of cryptanalysts in a basement, led by a man the establishment considered a brilliant but dangerously insubordinate eccentric. It came from a wild, unapproved gamble that had now, against all odds, paid off spectacularly. This new intelligence didn't just reveal the enemy's plan, it completely invalidated the official narrative being pushed by the highest levels of the Navy. The discovery was a weapon, but a double-edged one. Think of it like this: imagine a team of detectives has been working for months on a high-profile murder case. The lead detective in the capital, using all the official resources, has built an ironclad case against suspect A. The precinct detectives on the ground, however, have a gut feeling he's wrong. They run a wild, off-the-books experiment and discover a single piece of evidence, a fingerprint that not only exonerates suspect A, but definitively proves the killer is actually suspect B, the last person anyone would have suspected. This is fantastic news for the cause of justice. But it is a catastrophic embarrassment for the lead detective and the entire department that backed him. This was the position Nimitz was now in. He possessed the ground truth. But this truth directly contradicted the official reality of his superiors. To act on this new intelligence, to ignore Washington's directives about the Aleutians, and instead turn his entire fleet towards Midway would be a monumental act of defiance. He would be betting everything: his ships, his men, his career, and the fate of the war in the Pacific on the word of Joe Rochefort's basement operation. It was a truth so uncomfortable, so politically inconvenient, that a lesser commander might have hesitated, sought further confirmation, or tried to compromise. But Nimitz was not a lesser commander. He knew that the war wasn't fought in the tidy offices of Washington, D.C. It was fought in the bloody water and the burning sky. And in that world, the only truth that mattered was the one that got you to the right place at the right time. The new path forward was now terrifyingly clear. He had to stop the move north. He had to concentrate every single plane, every single ship, every single man he had, and get them to a tiny patch of ocean a few hundred miles northeast of Midway. And he had to do it now. The Japanese fleet had already sailed. The intelligence was a bomb thrown into the heart of the American war machine. But it wasn't just a bomb, it was a truth nobody in a position of power wanted to hear. The moment Layton transmitted Rochefort's findings to Washington, the system, which had been so confident in its own logic, recoiled. The official explanation, the Aleutian feint, wasn't just a theory anymore. It had become dogma. Careers were attached to it. Reputations were built on it. An entire strategic posture had been constructed around it. Rochefort's decrypt wasn't seen as a brilliant breakthrough, it was seen as an attack. The response from OP-20G was swift and dismissive. They fired back a series of sharp, condescending messages to Pearl Harbor. Rochefort's team, they argued, was inexperienced. They were prone to localitis, a dangerous condition where an isolated outpost becomes so obsessed with its immediate surroundings that it loses all strategic perspective. They were seeing ghosts in the static because they wanted to see ghosts near Hawaii. The AF is short on water message. It was obviously a plant. A clever piece of Japanese deception designed to make the Americans think the target was Midway, drawing the Pacific Fleet into a trap while the real attack hit the Aleutians. They accused Rochefort of falling for the very trick he thought he was playing. The irony was suffocating. Washington was now using the enemy's potential genius as a club to beat down its own actual genius. The battle of realities had begun. It was no longer a fight against the Japanese, but an internal war between Pearl Harbor and Washington. On one side was the ground truth, forged in the sleepless, smoke-filled dungeon, built on a deep, intuitive understanding of the enemy. On the other was the official story, born in the sanitized, politically charged corridors of the capital, built on a rigid, almost arrogant, adherence to conventional strategic wisdom. Admiral King, the formidable chief of naval operations in Washington, found himself in an impossible position. He was a man who trusted the system, the chain of command. And the official system, in the form of OP-20G, was telling him in no uncertain terms that the Pearl Harbor unit had gone rogue. They were being emotional, hysterical. He was inclined to believe his own people in Washington. Yet, out in the Pacific, his theater commander, Nimitz, a man whose judgment King respected, was suddenly making moves that defied all of Washington's strategic assessments. Nimitz, with a quiet and unshakable resolve, was now engaged in a dangerous double game. Publicly, he paid lip service to the Aleutian threat, sending a small cruiser and destroyer force north just enough to placate Washington and maintain the illusion that he was following their lead. But secretly, he was engaged in a frantic, desperate race against time, redirecting every vital asset he had towards a single, obscure point on the map designated Point Luck, northeast of Midway. He was operating on Rochefort's intelligence as if it were gospel, while simultaneously trying to fend off the constant, nagging interference of his own high command. The teletype lines between Pearl and D.C. crackled with tension. Washington demanded to know why Nimitz was holding his main carrier forces back. Nimitz offered vague, evasive answers about logistical needs and fleet readiness. It was a subtle, carefully worded mutiny. He wasn't just disobeying a suggestion, he was ignoring the entire strategic framework laid down by his superiors. He was siding with his renegade codebreakers against the established wisdom of the entire U.S. Navy. The system was pushing back, and it was pushing back hard. For the men in the dungeon, their moment of triumph had become a curse. They had delivered the truth, but the truth was so revolutionary, so contrary to the accepted reality, that they were now being treated not as saviors, but as heretics. The final blow from Washington landed like a punch to the gut. It arrived in the form of a direct order to Admiral Nimitz, over Admiral King's signature. The language was cold, formal, and left no room for interpretation. OP-20 GS analysis was to be considered the definitive intelligence product for the Pacific Fleet. The threat to the Aleutians was primary. Task Force 16 was to proceed north as a priority. The communication was a public, official slapdown. It was the system reasserting its dominance, a king telling his provincial governor to fall in line. Rochefort and his entire station were, in effect, being formally discredited. Their intelligence was to be disregarded. They were ordered to cease offering strategic analysis and confine their work to simple decryption and translation. They were to be typists, not investigators. For Joe Rochefort, this was the lowest point. He had stared into the mind of the enemy, deciphered his darkest secrets, and handed the key to victory to his commanders on a silver platter. And his reward was to be silenced, to be told that his masterpiece of cryptanalysis was a delusion, a piece of amateur hysteria. He and his team were confined to their basement, not by locked doors, but by the crushing weight of a bureaucracy that refused to see the truth. They were forced to sit and listen to the Japanese radio traffic, every message a confirmation of their now discredited theory, knowing that the men on the surface were being ordered to sail in the wrong direction. Every tick of the teletype was another nail in the coffin of the Pacific Fleet. They felt like doctors who had discovered the cure for a plague, only to be locked in a closet by hospital administrators who insisted on treating the patients with leeches. The injustice was profound, but the true tragedy was unfolding on the vast blue map. The Japanese plan Operation MI was now irrevocably in motion. 4 of their best aircraft carriers, the very same veterans of Pearl Harbor Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were steaming under radio silence, an invincible armada aimed at the heart of the American position. They were the tip of a spear that included battleships, cruisers, and hundreds of the world's finest naval aviators. They were sailing towards a date with destiny off Midway Atoll, supremely confident that they would achieve complete surprise, that the American carriers would be hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away. And thanks to the official orders from Washington, they were almost right. The institutional blindness, the refusal to accept the uncomfortable truth from the dungeon, had set the stage for the very disaster Rochefort had tried to prevent. The elegant, logical plan conceived in Washington was now the de facto script for the U.S. Navy's own destruction. Nimitz was cornered, caught between a direct order from his superior and the terrifying certainty of his own intelligence team. The fate of the war hung on his next decision. Would he obey the system that had made him, or would he trust the whispers from the dungeon and commit the greatest act of insubordination in modern naval history? The trap wasn't just set for the American fleet. It was set for its commander. This is the moment where the cold, clean logic of the plan on paper collides with the brutal, unpredictable reality of a single commander's choice. On paper, Admiral Nimitz's path was clear: obey the chain of command, send the bulk of his forces north, and protect American soil in the Aleutians as ordered. To do anything else was unthinkable. It was insubordination of the highest order, an act that would see him court-martialed and disgraced, regardless of the outcome. But Nimitz wasn't looking at the paper. He was looking at the man who brought him the decrypts. He was looking at Commander Layton, whose unwavering belief in Rochefort's intelligence was a force of nature in itself. And through Layton, he was looking at Rochefort, the rumpled, chain-smoking oracle in the basement. Nimitz made his decision. It was a choice born not of arrogance, but of a profound and lonely responsibility. He chose to believe his own men. He chose to trust the ground truth over the official story. In one of the most audacious deceptions of the war, Nimitz performed a masterful piece of strategic sleight of hand. He obeyed the letter of Washington's law, but not its spirit. He dispatched a token force of cruisers and destroyers, a screen of ships just large enough to appear on reconnaissance reports as a credible threat, steaming north towards the Aleutians. It was a ghost fleet sent to fight a ghost army, a deliberate sacrifice to the god of bureaucracy in Washington. Meanwhile, every other warship that could float and fight was ordered to sea under the strictest radio silence. Task Force 16, with Enterprise and Hornet, did not turn north. It slipped out of Pearl Harbor and steamed northeast toward Point Luck. And in the most critical element of this desperate gamble, Nimitz ordered the carrier Yorktown, which had limped into Pearl Harbor just days earlier, grievously wounded from the Battle of the Coral Sea, to be repaired. The initial damage assessment said she needed 3 months in dry dock. Nimitz gave the yard workers 3 days. Swarms of men, 1,400 of them, worked around the clock, patching her flight deck with steel plates, shoring up her buckled frames, fighting fires that still smoldered deep within her hull. They didn't make her strong, they just made her fight. On May 30th, trailing an oil slick and still crawling with welders finishing their work, the zombie carrier Yorktown sailed to join the others, a third, crucial queen on a chessboard the enemy didn't even know was set. Nimitz had bet the farm. He had committed his entire, irreplaceable carrier force to a single point in the vast Pacific, based on an intelligence source his own command had officially discredited. On June 4, 1942, the unfolding catastrophe began, but it was not the one Washington had predicted. Just as Rochefort's timeline had forecasted, the Japanese striking force, the Kido Butai, arrived northwest of Midway. They were supremely confident, blissfully unaware. Their morning strike against the island was launched into the dawn, a hammer blow against a target they believed was completely unsuspecting. The reports that came back to Admiral Nagumo on the deck of the Akagi were puzzling. The resistance from the island was far heavier than anticipated. American bombers, flying from the atoll itself, were already attacking his fleet with suicidal courage. The surprise had been compromised. Then came the truly impossible report an enemy warship had been sighted. Then another. Then a report of an enemy carrier. It was a flicker of information that didn't fit the plan. The American fleet was supposed to be in the Aleutians. It couldn't be here. It was an anomaly, an impossibility. For the Japanese commanders, it was the first, terrifying moment of cognitive dissonance, the instant they realized the board they were playing on was not the one they had imagined. The ghost on the radio, the lie on the map, it hadn't been theirs. It had been the Americans. The catastrophe unfolded in a span of just 5 minutes. 5 minutes that decided the fate of the Pacific War. On the decks of the Japanese carriers, there was chaos. Admiral Nagumo, caught completely off guard, was trapped in a fatal moment of indecision. His planes from the Midway strike were returning, low on fuel and needing to land. At the same time, his scouts had finally, definitively, located the American carriers. His flight decks were a tangled mess of bombs and torpedoes, as his crews frantically tried to rearm their planes for a naval strike. Should he launch what he had ready, or recover his returning aircraft first? It was a tactician's nightmare, a choice between 2 bad options, with the fate of an empire resting on the outcome. He hesitated, and in that hesitation, history turned. High above, in the silent, sunlit emptiness of the upper atmosphere, American dive bombers were arriving. They had been led to this exact patch of ocean not by radar, not by luck, but by the painstaking work of the Codebreakers in the dungeon. The pilots of the Enterprise and the Yorktown peered down through their canopies and saw it the impossible, beautiful, terrifying sight of the entire Japanese carrier fleet laid out below them, their decks crowded with planes and ordnance, their combat air patrol of Zero fighters flying too low to intercept. It was a perfect target, a gift from Joe Rochefort. What followed was not a battle, it was an execution. The dauntless dive bombers tipped over and screamed downwards, their sirens wailing. The bombs struck the Kaga, turning her flight deck into a volcano of fire and exploding fuel. They struck the Soryu, which vanished in a cataclysmic blast. They struck the flagship, the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's own vessel, ripping through the deck and detonating among the fully armed torpedo bombers below. In less time than it takes to drink a cup of coffee, 3 of the Emperor's finest aircraft carriers were transformed into floating infernos. The 4th, the Hiryu, would follow them to the bottom a few hours later. The spearhead of the Japanese Navy, the force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months, was broken. Years later, long after the victory parades and the quiet return to civilian life, the documents began to be declassified. The secrets of the dungeon, guarded so closely during the war, were slowly, painstakingly brought into the light. Reports were unsealed. Memos were unearthed. Veterans, now old men with fading memories, were finally allowed to tell their stories. In the quiet archives of the Navy, historians pieced together the incredible truth. They found the original messages from Washington, the ones dismissing the Midway theory and ordering the fleet north. They found Nimitz's carefully worded, evasive replies. And they found the after-action reports, the logs, and the sworn testimony that confirmed, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that the entire American victory at Midway, the pivotal turning point of the war, had been built on a foundation of intelligence that the High Command had officially rejected. The vindication was absolute. Rochefort and his team had not been hysterical. They had not been suffering from localitis. They had been right. Stunningly, prophetically, history-alteringly right. The truth, buried for so long under the weight of official secrecy and bureaucratic pride, was finally out. The whispers from the dungeon had not just been whispers. They had been the roar of destiny. The declassified file doesn't just vindicate a person, it reveals a process. It allows us, decades later, to finally sit in the quiet of the archives and watch the ghost in the machine take shape. The story of Midway isn't just about a clever trick with a water condenser. It's about the triumph of a radical new type of warfare, a war fought not with steel, but with information. Let's step back into the War College one last time for the grand revelation. Think of conventional naval warfare as a game of battleship. 2 commanders sit on opposite sides of a screen, blindly calling out coordinates, hoping for a random hit. B5. Mississippi G7. Hit. It's a game of luck, brute force, and sheer probability. This is the game the Japanese thought they were playing. They had more ships, better planes, and more experienced crews. In a straight-up game of battleship, they would have won. They should have won. But Joseph Rochefort and his team in the dungeon weren't playing battleship. They were looking over the screen. The AF is short on water gambit was the final, brilliant move that allowed them to stop guessing and start seeing. It confirmed the location, yes, but the months of work leading up to it had given them something far more valuable: the enemy's entire playbook. They knew the Japanese order of battle, their operational timeline, the composition of their fleets, and, most critically, their assumptions. They knew the Japanese believed the American carriers were far away. They knew the Japanese believed they had the element of surprise. Nimitz didn't sail his fleet into an ambush. Armed with Rochefort's intelligence, he became the ambusher. He knew exactly where Nagumo's carriers would be, and at what time. He placed his own 3 carriers, his entire outnumbered force, in the perfect position to strike them while they were at their most vulnerable during the chaos of recovering and rearming their aircraft. The American victory at Midway wasn't a lucky punch. It was a perfectly timed, precisely aimed sniper shot, guided to its target by an invisible hand. The Codebreakers had turned the Pacific from an opaque battlefield into a transparent chessboard, and Nimitz, unlike his opponent, could see all the pieces. The echoes of this moment are profound. The official story, the one from Washington, was built on